Good morning, YouTube. I have a confession to make. I am a Christian. Yes, praise Jesus. I am a Christian. What? Didn't you know? Oh my god, it is like so totally apparent. Yes, YouTube. I am a Christian. No, I am not a Christian, but that did not stop someone from accusing me of being a Christian on Amazon today for a review I wrote on two books. Witches, Druids, and King Arthur by Professor Ronald Hutton, and The Witch, also by Professor Ronald Hutton. Now, the review in which I was called a Christian was for Witches, Druids, and King Arthur. In it, I quote rather verbatim a blog post that I had written titled something along the lines of the sound of the gunshot or the gunshot that wasn't heard or something to that effect. And it was about a confession that Professor Hutton made in this book that received almost no attention from the pagan community at large. And that was that while he was writing, and I've read almost every single book Professor Hutton has written, so I think I'm able to talk about his work relatively accurately, aside from the fact that I have read many more specialty scholarly books and articles than he has on given subjects. But it is actually within this book in which he makes the astonishing confession that while he was writing his landmark book, The Triumph of the Moon, he confessed that he did indeed find evidence tracing Wicca back to remote antiquity. However, he took it upon himself, that is a key point, he took it upon himself to ignore it and treat that evidence as though it were non-existent. That is only one of the, well, that's not really a flaw per se, but it should be treated as a larger issue spanning his collective work. But this book is filled with flaws, such as cherry-picking evidence and making umbrella statements for which you provide absolutely no proof. In it, he claims that it quickly became evident that paganism died quickly and was easily and simply displaced by Christianity. To whom did it become quickly apparent to? He cites absolutely no sources. In fact, often one of the problems I have read in the span his work is he will make a conclusion, but he cites no scholars that are ever in agreement with him, which leads one to conclude that few scholars do actually agree with his conservative views. He later on suggests a time by which paganism was dead throughout Europe, and he gives it by like the 7th century, I think. He doesn't give a reason for that date. However, he does cite a book that I also own. I don't have it right here with me, but it's Hellenism in Late Antiquity by Professor Bowersock. Professor Hutton cites every single chapter from that book except the first chapter, and this is another important example of cherry picking. He completely ignores the first chapter, in which Professor Bowersock was able to not only demonstrate but prove that paganism had lingered far longer than Professor Hutton was willing to allow. You know, the thing with Professor Hutton is I don't dislike him. I like him very much. I don't personally know him, so this isn't a personal attack in any sense. The irony is, me being accused of being a conservative Christian and pretending to be pagan is really a charge that should be levied onto Professor Hutton and his work by anyone who's actually read it. Because if you've read his work, he really does seem as though he has an agenda as he's writing. An agenda that he simply won't state. In fact, his perception in America is very different than it is in the UK, where he is from. British pagans tend to acknowledge that yes, he does have an agenda while he's in his books that he's not coming forward with. Yet here in the U.S., a cult of personality has developed around him, in which if you question anything that he's written for any reason whatsoever, you are accused of hating him, of being a float bunny, of this, that, and the other, of all these really negative unacademic atrocities. And I can assure you that I am extremely academic in my work. I have been researching many topics for many, many years, more than 20 years. In fact, let me scoot back for a minute. This box this box and this box enumerate only about a third of all the academic specialty books and academic articles that I have read on the subject of Celtic studies for the past 25 years. That is a very long time. Now, let's take a trip back in time. My views are my views. My views are my own because of the research that I had been performing at that time. Research that is based on what the specialty scholars in their respective academic fields have held for many, many years. That is still current today. It was while reading Professor Hutton's earlier polemic, The Pagan Religions of the Ancient British Isles, that it occurred to me over the years that Professor Hutton is the Sheldon Cooper of academia. He behaves as though specialty scholars in their respective fields have it all wrong. Meanwhile, he, in his academic superiority, in his own esteemed brilliance, has it absolutely correct. And you really do get that impression by the way in which he dismisses whole swaths of specialty scholars, of their research. You get it also by the fact that in none of his books does he cite a single reference that is in agreement with his very conservative point of view. And again, this isn't because I dislike him. It's because he's just not giving his pagan readers the whole story. However, his views have created this cult of personality in America in which it is increasingly verboten to disagree with Professor Hutton in any way, shape, or form unless you are disregarded as being unreasonable. And in a religion that prides itself on free thinking and freedom of thought, that is extremely troubling. So starting with his book, The Pagan Religions of the Ancient British Isles, absolutely nowhere did he mention the wealth of Celtic studies on the subject of the sovereignty goddess and kingship rituals. He treated it as though it were completely non-existent. He disregarded the entire notion of Celtic gods as basically literary fantasies, literary inventions by Celtic scribes who are trying to simply retell Greco-Roman mythology. I believe that he is still trying to maintain that position today in his book Celtic Britain. I'm not 100% on that, but it's the general sense I've been getting while I've been reading it. However, if you were simply to read the book The Gods of the Celts and the Indo-Europeans by Professor Garrett Olmsted, it would become immediately apparent to him that it's extremely unlikely that the monastic scribes in Ireland were trying to simply retell a Greco-Roman mythology. They would have used far different words. They would have used far different phrasing and mythic structures to do so, because again, it would have been hearsay. It would have been somewhat corrupted along the way. However, Garrett Olmsted shows that the monastic scribes were copying very accurately of an oral tradition that had been handed down to them, because it matched so precisely with the Vedic, the Indian mythology that was being written down at the time, or centuries beforehand. So much so that it cannot be a coincidence, because it is so identical and precise. That totally discredits Professor Hutton's theory right then and there. Another theory he actually advances in this book, but which he started advancing in this book, is that the famous Paleolithic cave painting of the sorcerer in the cave of the three brothers. My French is rusty. I am totally not going to pronounce that because my tongue would get way too tied this early in the morning. But he insists rather firmly he insists that that image cannot be accepted as evidence for a horned deity of any kind, because the horns were later additions by the sketch artist who noticed the cracks above the image of the quote-unquote sorcerer. So he or she included those cracks and created a sort of what Professor Hutton regards as a modern myth. However, Professor Hutton is well aware of the work of David Lewis Williams. He cites his book, The Shamans of Prehistory. However, he does not cite his much more recent work, Inside the Neolithic Mind and The Mind in the Cave. I have that book as well, but I cannot find it right now. It's downstairs somewhere. And in this study, Professor Lewis Williams makes it exceptionally clear that Paleolithic and Neolithic cave artisans incorporated the natural features of the caves, the cracks, the walls, the bumps and grooves, into their artwork, and they probably did so as well with this image of the sorcerer in La Traffrere. So it's extreme. So his position that it shouldn't be accepted as evidence for a horn god is extremely unlikely. The cave artisans almost certainly intentionally incorporated those cracks as horns. But I could go on and on and on, because Professor Hutton's work is littered with sweeping umbrella statements that, when you analyze them more closely, are completely inaccurate. In this book, he claims that Wicca must be a modern religion because we invoke our gods. Since invoking the gods, he assures us that no god in antiquity worth the name would have been invoked. However, anyone who's actually studied ancient paganism will know, especially Greco-Roman paganism, will know that it was that there was the rule, not the exception, to invoke the gods into their respective cult images. He also employs the logic fallacy of special pleading in this book. He's in disagreement with some author, And he contrives a special rule that this author, he feels, should have abided by, even though 3 pages later Professor Hutton breaks that same rule for himself. It's shit like that that makes me extremely wary of Professor Hutton as a scholar, as an authority, and I don't think I am wrong by saying so. I really, if I engaged in even a minute percentage of that, I would have absolutely no respect to speak of in my community, and deservedly so. Professor Hutton has made wild claims based on absolutely no evidence whatsoever. He insists that Dr. Roper found no evidence for paganism in her study of the German trials. However, you can't really say that because there's no evidence. Well, paganism wasn't even on Dr. Roper's radar. It wasn't even a part of her thesis. He also accuses, or he also employs as evidence, the fact that Oxford had stopped publishing Dr. Margaret Murray's book, The Witch Cult, which is untrue. Oxford had continued publishing her work for a very long time, but he also claims that, as evidence of how poorly she was regarded in academia, that Russell Hope Robbins, in his Encyclopedia of Witchcraft, ignored her. Which, you can't really say that that's evidence either. Just because an author happens not to discuss something doesn't really necessarily prove a negative for that. So, as I hope I made fairly clear, I do have a reason for not particularly accepting Professor Hutton at his word. In fact, if you read his works very carefully, and if you look at the evidence for yourself, you'll find that he either attempts to get his readers to jump to conclusions for which there's really no evidence, or the evidence can really be read in a very different manner than Professor Hutton is allowing. So I hope I've really sort of explained the issue with you. And for the record, no, I am not a Christian parading as a pagan. In fact, given Hutton's track record, that accusation can be levied at him. So this isn't because I dislike Professor Hutton. If I disliked him, I would not continue to buy his books. I just like knowing what he's saying and how that might be influencing the local pagan community, because his voice does have a larger following than I feel it should. I would be much more comfortable if he were regarded as being one voice in a choir rather than a diva in a sense. But that's just my opinion, and I really hope you those of you who disagree with me with regard to Professor Hutton will gain a greater understanding as to why I disagree with him. Every time I read one of his books now, because of this book, I keep asking myself, well, what is he leaving out? What is he not telling me that he should? And that is why. It's because I don't necessarily trust him as a scholar. It's because I know what he's leaving out, and I simply don't think it's right. I think it's misleading. So, until next time, my pagan brothers and sisters, keep calm and witch on. Show you my ancestral shrine this year. This is my shrine devoted to my gay and lesbian elders and ancestors who are almighty dead. They have passed and are no longer with us, particularly from the dark years in the 80s.